Hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I am joined by my friends and yours, Mr. Scott Edberg and Jared Nelson. Hey guys, what's going on?
Yo.
Nothing much. Just writing overtures and preparing for sermons.
You were grinding up coffee beans and making espresso a few minutes ago.
Yeah, it was, we have an offshoot of this podcast. It's going to be ASMR coffee roasting.
Oh boy.
You never know what's going to come out of my mouth.
You never know. Well, I mean, full disclosure, as we begin recording this episode, listeners, we hope that this episode will only exist for maybe the next 47, 48 years. It's a very temporary episode, if all things go according to plan. We are beginning our foray into the Directory for Worship, the last main section of our Book of Church Order. And before we get into chapter 47, it is time for us to talk about the temporary statement that is listed just before chapter 47. So if you're in the Book of Church Order, you'll see part 3, the Directory for the Worship of God, and then a temporary statement that was adopted by the Third General Assembly, and then chapter 47 begins the final section of the book. We just want to answer the question, basically, what's going on? What's a directory for worship, and why is there a temporary statement in the PCA's directory for worship? You may have heard that the directory for worship in the PCA is not constitutional. We want to talk about what that means, why it matters, how it arrived at this point, and we're going to do our best to assume no knowledge on y'all's part or on my part for the most part. Jared and Scott have studied this at length. They're involved in, current modern day controversies related to these things in the broader PCA. And I'm jesting, of course, big jokes. But we want to kind of work from the bottom up and consider these things as they come to us in the book. So maybe the best question to start with as we get into the final section is, what is a directory for worship? We need to get some categories to help us think through it. And I think first I'll reference you back to our episode with, was it Patrick Curls? Was that his first name? He gave us some really good things to think through. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But Jared, maybe I'll kick to you first. You've written an article about the directory and about the temporary statement, which we'll also link. Can you help us think through some of the historical aspects of a directory for worship and what the purpose of a directory might be?
Sure. The first directory for worship goes all the way back to the 1600s, the Westminster Assembly. They were revising the 39 articles, but also wanted a revision of how they did worship and not just using a Book of Common Prayer, which gave you not only the elements, but the content, the forms, exactly what you're supposed to say for all the prayers, for all the transitions and everything like that. And so the directory actually was something of a via media, maybe a third way, between the full dictating everything that you say of the prayer book and the anything goes, whatever it is that you want to do, feel led by the Spirit that day. So the directory says what ought to be in worship in terms of the elements, and also speaks a bit to the manner, the tone, how it is that you are to go through these elements as the minister is leading those things. And every Reformed and Presbyterian denomination has had some sort of directory for worship that has been binding to some degree since then. In the PCA, it's been a little bit different. In the founding of the PCA in 1973, of course, you have to do a whole lot of stuff in your first days. Make sure that you have an agreed upon confession. That actually took some time, having a committee that was just looking at the constitutional documents. And so some of the first big questions were, where are we going to adopt what the OPC did in their confession, and then started working through the form of government. Are we a 2 or 3 office church? That was one of the big questions at first. The directory, it was later. They basically approved the directory in the Third General Assembly, but with this temporary statement, because they were going to go back and revise it. And if somebody wants to read more about that, I have an article. It's called The Unfinished Business of the Founding, because after that, it was always put by the first stated clerk, Morton Smith, under the unfinished business of something they were supposed to return back to in subsequent GAs. They did, but never got something more agreed on than the chapters on the sacraments, basically. So it was something that they were working on, but for many different reasons got sidelined. Probably debates over exactly what it should look like. I talked once at length with David Coffin, who remembers some of the early days where they were still talking about it even by the 16th General Assembly, and he just said it was BCO fatigue. There was a certain point in which they just got tired of messing with their BCO for a while and didn't want to talk about it anymore. And you had various overtures that came up that try to delete that or to try to revise it. And every time there's this, as Coffin says, this fatigue to deal with the BCO. And so the temporary statement put on in 1975 just enjoyed its 50th anniversary. So I can celebrate that.
BCO fatigue is what we're going to change the name of our podcast to eventually, I think. So it's exciting.
It kind of sounds that when you're building an institution, there's so much work that must be done. When you're talking about ratifying your confessional documents, developing your Book of Church Order, I could see near the end you sputtering out and struggling to get across the finish line. Some things, it's like when you have a general contractor in your house and they get 85% done with the project and now they're ready to move on to the next project because they're tired of working on the project that you paid them for. And that's kind of what I sense here is where we as a denomination, when we were building the institution, we got so far that we exhausted ourselves and needed a break. And we still have this issue in the PC. I think it's human. We get this with study committees. We went through a season where study committees we were fatigued of them and we had none, and now we have two. And maybe that's a way we can get with overtures as well, just generally. It seems like we're going to have a lot of overtures this year. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them just get turned down because of that idea of fatigue, where it's like, man, we've been really churning out constitutional amendments, 13 this year. How many are we going to have next year? Maybe we won't have many because of that sort of fatigue. We get tired, and this is a lot of work. And so perhaps now, 50 years later, the fatigue has subsided, and we can finish what our founders intended to finish.
Well, and we see glimmers of that intention earlier in the book. So, they get further along and they got tired of dealing with it. But just a couple of thoughts here. In the third section of our preface at the beginning of the book, when the Constitution is defined, it's not just listed as the doctrinal standards and the Book of Church Order, but the sections of the book are actually listed. So it's the Book of Church Order comprising the form of government, rules of discipline, and directory for worship. And so there you can see in there sort of this assumption maybe that eventually it would be fully adopted as constitutional. But of course, it just, things happened. Or in chapter 12, right? When we're talking about the church session, how is the church session supposed to oversee worship? And there's a reference there that they're supposed to use the directory for worship at the back of the book. I'm not going to argue that those statements make the directory constitutionally binding. I think that would just be a little foolish to make that argument right now.
Although Morton did.
Yeah, well, Morton and I will talk one day. But you can kind of see hints at what men were expecting, I think. And yet we get to the end and they sort of, puttered out, as we've said. So let's talk about that temporary statement then. It almost sort of feels like never mind. Like we were going to do this, but we, forget about it. We're done. And we're just going to put this temporary paragraph in here and just see what happens in the future. Why? Maybe one of you guys.
Why don't you read it? Read the temporary.
Well, let's read it in a second. But I want to. Why have a temporary statement instead of just getting rid of it? Before we even talk about what it says, why bother having a statement like this in our book? It's very. A statement like this is weird if you consider the whole book as we've gone through it, right?
Yeah. Well, originally it was a placeholder. They were approving the old PCUS language from the old Book of Church Order with the knowledge that the Documents Committee was going to change it or suggest changes, which they eventually were doing when this became a topic that was controversial, and we moved on and said, let's not do this right now. So the reason we have it in there is the original language was approved, but we kind of knew, hey, we're going to revise this. It's kind of once you send something up, it's a first draft. Well, here's the language, but I'm going to revise this.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. But let's read it. It's a great idea, Scott. Did I lose sound from y'all?
No.
Okay. Something. All right.
Just read the statement, man. Read it.
All right, guys. All right. This is
we can mute
Polity
ourselves.
Matters live, just like Presbycast. All right. Temporary statement adopted by the Third General Assembly to preface the Directory for Worship. The Directory for Worship is an approved guide and should be taken seriously as the mind of the church agreeable to the standards. However, it does not have the force of law and is not to be considered obligatory in all its parts. BCO 56, 57, and 58 have been given full constitutional authority by the 11th General Assembly after being submitted to the presbyteries and receiving the necessary approval of 2/3 of the presbyteries. BCO 59-3, as amended, has been given full constitutional authority by the 47th General Assembly after being submitted to the presbyteries and receiving the necessary approval of 2/3 of the presbyteries. So we have the temporary statement, and then, which is rather short compared to the whole paragraph, it's less than half the paragraph, and then a couple of sentences related to some changes that were made at the 11th and 47th assemblies. Guys, let's just kind of do our thing like we do with the book and work through this, phrase at a time. Let me back up to it. So the Directory for Worship is an approved guide. I guess the first question would be, approved by who? How did this come to us? The directory, it is what it is. It's these certain chapters, but who's approved this? Was it approved in the normal way that we approve a constitutional document, or some other way?
Well,
we already talked about this.
The Third General Assembly approved the language, and they approved this temporary statement at the same time. So they approved it, and they said they liked it, but they needed to work on it. And so it was approved during this period of time in which you could approve the constitutional documents without the 2/3 presbytery requirement. They had that as part of their founding for the GAs to determine their constitutional documents, to make it a little bit simpler, and then from there to work on revisions with a different process. So approved by the Third General Assembly, but also approved with this temporary statement.
Not my directory. That's all I gotta say. Did not get to vote on it. Yeah, and so it's an approved guide, and they give us some. Is this what? Is this pious advice? It should be taken seriously as the mind of the church, agreeable to the standards. There's a lot in there. We should clarify. For what standards are they referring to? I'm assuming they're referring to doctrinal standards, that phrase is used in other parts of the book to refer to Westminster. The church finds these agreeable with our doctrinal standards, and so we should take this directory seriously. How is that different from the directory being constitutionally binding?
I think that's part of the tension that Smith was seeing there. And also a misunderstanding, I think, today, because we haven't had a directory, of how a directory usually functions.
Mm-hmm.
There's very few shalls usually in a directory. You shall have this element, but you may do it in this way or may do it in that way. I think, we think about like certain elements such as having prayers, psalms, singing, a sermon, reading of scripture. You have these, but where do they go? What is the reading that day? We don't have a lectionary. We don't have set forms. So usually a directory works that most of it is pious advice with a few shalls. And so this kind of leaves it all in the element of pious advice with a temporary statement, which is what most of the directory would be.
Yeah, I think we have an issue in the PCA where our Book of Church Order is often used. We only focus on that middle part, on the rules of discipline, and everything is a bludgeon. But the first part, the form of government, is helpful structure for our courts and our system of doctrine. And I think it would be better to compare the directory more to part 1 of the BCO than to part 2. There's a worry that if we constitutionalize a directory, it will be used primarily in the focus of ecclesiastical judicial cases. But I think it's better to be compared and used in the context of our form of government than our rules of discipline. Though it would still guide our worship, I think there is a misconception that the book is just meant to be used as a law book and not merely as a guidebook. While there is that tension, I think it's helpful to rephrase what it would be used for. And I don't think the primary use of the directory would be for discipline of its members. I think it's meant to be more of a structural guide like the form of government.
That's good. Yeah, and so you have this next phrase in there, it should be taken seriously. However, it does not have the force of law and is not to be considered obligatory in all its parts. These sentences just beg so many questions, right, as to the minds of the authors. I mean, okay, obligatory in all its parts, but does that mean it's obligatory in some of its parts? And of course, we would say, yes, the Directory for Worship is obligatory in some of its parts, even just by common sense, right? Should you have the preaching of the word in a worship service? Yeah, that part of it is obviously obligatory, even if it's not a constitutionally binding sentence. These elements are obligatory because the scriptures oblige us to perform that way. But over time, we have constitutionalized, 3 chapters plus a section of this directory. So chapters 56, 57, 58, and 59.3, having to do with sacraments in those first 3 chapters, and one section concerning the solemnization of marriage that we just constitutionalized several years ago. Well, I mean, do we want to speak, guys, at all before we get into those chapters in the future? Do we want to speak much to why these particular chapters were made constitutional? I remember some of the history leading up to 59.3, but I wasn't around at the 11th General Assembly, so I'm not sure exactly what the arguments were regarding 56, 57, 58. Jared, you're our history guy. Maybe you've got something there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, what's funny about the temporary statement, though, is that it's not entirely accurate. It wasn't, when I was researching that article, it actually wasn't the 11th General Assembly, it was the 9th.
What?
And the 11th just went back and said, yeah, in the 9th we approved 6, 57, 58 as having the force of law. So it went through the presbyteries earlier. But those were seen as things that they needed to have commonality on for sacraments. I mean, think about it. Questions may come up of, well, can I have somebody that's a Baptist come in? And do I have to use the words of institution? Well, there actually are certain forms in regards to the sacraments that you have to have. You have to have the words of institution for baptism and for the Lord's Supper in some form for them to be valid. And so they made sense to do that. What's funny is my presbytery back in its earlier days had a case that came down that involved somebody not following BCO 58, and they overtured the GA to take away the constitutional status of 56, 57, 58, I think because they were mad that it was used against them. It didn't eventually pass the presbyteries, but they thought about it. But yeah, so those were made constitutional because we thought, we at least can say that we have to have a certain way that we're all doing the sacraments.
I think perhaps 56, 57, 58 are a good case study of what the directory could be in its totality for the denomination. As they are constitutionally binding sections, there is still great liberty throughout our churches and how the sacraments are applied or administered. The big parts remain there, but there is great liberty as you go from church to church. And in that liberty, there is not a violation of our book. And so in my mind, if we could apply it to the seriousness of the sacraments and be happy as a denomination regarding this, why can't this also be then applied to prayer, preaching, and other elements in the worship service? If we could do it in these narrow parts, and probably part of the most important parts of our worship, as it relates to the means of grace, why can't it be part of these other elements of the means of grace as well? And so if we could do it in those parts, I think that the case is pretty plain that we can do it with the whole if we just work towards it.
Yeah. Well, it raises all sorts of questions that I want to ask, but I'm going to hold my tongue until we get into those chapters. I think I'll leave it for those episodes.
Well, it is interesting that this has been reopened really at the 47th General Assembly.
Yeah.
Because that's where 59.3 was adopted as being binding. And that came up because of controversies over same-sex marriage being legalized, and really had some chaplains that were asking, do I have some protection so that I don't have to do this if my call is coming in a sense from the Army, but I'm under the authority of the church? I need to be able to point to something to say, my church believes this about marriage, more than just the standards even, because the PCUSA has those and they don't follow them. And so this section was made constitutional in some ways to give guidance to pastors, but also to give some cover to chaplains so that this 59 being on marriage, and that particular one defining marriage, actually quoting our standards there, but then adding, those who perform marriages shall perform none but these.
Yeah, it was just another tent peg to stick down, right? We had the standards already dealing with it, but added to the BCO, just kind of gave them more grounding. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't really thought about it until you just said it. That really is what spiked this whole conversation. What was that, 5 years ago? Or 6 years ago, depending on COVID. Anyway.
2018.
Was it 18? Oh, yeah, so it was
year.
6 years ago now. Well, I don't know how to count anymore after COVID. So,
you just erased that
really
year.
that's the history of it, where we are now. We've been talking about it, slowly more and more over the years. And of course, now it's coming to a head in many ways, which we'll deal with as we work through all these sections. maybe I don't know. Do you guys want to trace through kind of what the current quote unquote controversy is surrounding the directory? We've maybe one of y'all can, Scott, you probably have this more in your head. What exactly did the GA do this last summer in relationship to the directory moving forward?
Yeah, so we passed an overture to constitute a committee to recommend changes for authoritative use in the directory. There will likely be, I think, as there was in the overtures committee, what does the word authoritative mean? I think it means constitutional. We'll have to wait until what the actual committee determines on that. But this committee will provide changes and revisions to the directory, and it'll probably take some years. I don't think this is a project that you can get done in 10 months, because that's really the time frame you'd have.
Let me just get AI to do it, right? And then
you can just get AI. AI can do everything for us. Just rewrite a directory that's appealing to all. I think some of the worries about the directory is there is a fear that the directory is going to spell out and narrow some of the aspects within our worship too much. The directory should naturally narrow or give guidelines or give rails to where we cannot go. But some people believe that the constitutionalization of the directory will try to narrow the PCA further than what it is currently today. And so probably one of the most common elements for that will be likely the reading of Scripture, who can read the Scripture in the service. If you look at our current directory, it's schizophrenic in that in the first section it says a minister shall do this, and then the very next session it says, well, anyone that the session deems fit to do this may do this. And so right now we have a contradictory in the directory as it relates to who can read worship. And so there's a worry that constitutionalizing this will seek to narrow. My thought generally, though, is that it would have to be 2/3 of the presbyteries to approve any sort of revision. And so a narrowing would have to be a supermajority of the denomination. And I don't think we're in that place. I think the better approach when thinking through this that could perhaps calm is to take it generally. Let's have a general directory. If someone wants to narrow it, then that will be the prerogative of a future assembly. But yeah, the controversy is this is only being considered because we want to narrow our current ministry. But I think, and what I hope, is that our current committee will show us that that's not the intent of the constitutionalizing of this work.
I think there are some people who would like to see the directory in place for their own hobby horse of whatever it may be. But I think that's part of the issue that we have, that we need to relearn what the directory is for. It's not necessarily just a discipline document. It's supposed to guide our worship. And there's going to be some things that you're going to have to be silent on, or there's going to be different practices. I've talked to some people who think that the minister should lead everything in worship, whereas I really want to get my ruling elders involved. And then I've had debates with people about, well, what do you let your ruling elders do? Like, what should only be the minister doing? What should only be the ruling elders? And that's going to differ. I have can only the minister pronounce an assurance of pardon, or can the ruling elder do that? What about the pastoral prayer? What about when the pastor isn't there? So I think having it under the authority of the session for that. And that's really going to be the rub, though. Who can do some of these parts of worship? And in the end, it might be silent about that, just putting it under the authority of the session and being somewhat silent on some of those measures, other than what's already been said, that you can't have you can't have just anybody preach or something like that. But there are elements. I mean, there's going to be elements in which things are going to be controversial, and you have to decide, are we going to come down on one area, or are we going to have some liberty, whether it's giving of offerings or any of those sorts of things. There's been a lot of diversity within the Reformed tradition of what elements look like, where they're at, and that's just something we're going to have to figure out along the way. And it's a good education. I mean, the most important thing that the church does is worship. And so for those who are wondering why we're going through the directory of worship, even though it's not constitutional, worship is worth talking about in detail, to think through what we're doing. If this is the most important thing that the church is doing and will be doing in eternity, it's worth thought, debate, discussion about that most important thing that the church does.
Yeah. That's the great irony of this, right? That we have a form of government. We think polity, in some ways, we think polity and discipline is more important than worship in the PCA by how we structured our book. And we need principles in our government and polity, and we need principles in our discipline that are binding to us. But worship, you do whatever you want. You do whatever is right in your own eyes. We'll let the our standards be silent on that or just offer pious advice on it. It's quite ironic.
We'll
And
bring
why we
Nadab
should
and
consider-
Abihu on as guests and ask them what they think about that in future.
Nadab and Abihu approach the PCA, Leviticus 9.
I think that's well said and maybe a good place for us to land. I'll ask you guys if you guys have any final thoughts here in a second. But Jared, I think it's well said, right in line with our first shorter catechism question. What's the main purpose of our life as God's people, just as people in general, is to live our lives toward Him, is to worship Him. And I think while there's always the caveat for sessions as they oversee worship in their churches, a constitutional part of our Book of Church Order does tell us in 12.5 that sessions should use the directory to oversee their worship. And so I think with all the ruling elders that we have listening, and I know there's a handful of teaching elders out there too, we would encourage you in general, men, to use the directory as it's been given to us to oversee your worship and to use it as a guide for you. I mean, 12.5e says sessions are to exercise in accordance with the directory authority over the time and place of the preaching of the word and administration of the sacraments, over all other religious services, over the music, over the uses to which the church building and associated properties may be put. You can go read the rest of that section. We need help in these matters, and the directory has been given for that purpose. And sometimes we can treat something that is quote unquote not constitutional as if it's just useless entirely. But the temporary statement is very helpful. It tells us that this should be taken seriously as the mind of the church agreeable to the standards. And so you guys out there who are listening, take note and make use of this. It is an often neglected part of our BCO and really should be one of our favorite parts of the BCO. One of the ways that we use it to disciple our people. So that's my last 2 cents. Guys, any last takeaways you guys want to offer as we finish up our conversation on this temporary statement?
Despite it being there's a two-edged sword there with the temporary statement on it being important and vital, but not obligatory. I think what history has revealed to me in our denomination is the non-obligatory part of that statement has caused our current directory to be irrelevant in many regards. And I have to fight against that myself. And one of the most important parts of this project, I think, moving forward is to making a directory that is relevant to the church, relevant to the whole of the PCA, making it a part of the BCO you actually open. Because if I'm honest with myself, the only parts I ever open in the directory are the vows for membership. And it's because all those other parts are not binding. And so I think the natural culture has led the temporary statement, the negative net on that is that it has made the directory irrelevant. What's the point of editing this thing if it's only pious advice? Why are we going to send something to 2/3 of the presbytery that has no constitutional authority? It just doesn't make sense. And so this is a good project that if we can complete, will make part of our Constitution relevant that hasn't been relevant.
Yeah, I think if you're thinking of the directory, the context that you should be thinking of is mostly the church service, not the SJC or the church courts. This is supposed to be meant to be used there. And I just say go and read some of the directory, especially if you are a ruling elder and you've been asked to help lead worship, or you're a new teaching elder. There are really helpful things in there. Pious advice is good, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Chapter 52. Like if I have to pray in public, how do I do that? You basically have the acts structure there, adoration, thanks to him, confession of sin, supplication. And you read through that and you're able to do public prayer as a new ruling elder, new teaching elder after reading chapter 52. It's really helpful. The directory is something that we can take with us into the pulpit and is very useful there, not just in our session meeting.
Well, listeners, stay tuned. Dial in for our adventure through the directory for worship. We're going to try to bring some guys in to talk about different elements of this, men with a little more experience in particular places. But we are looking forward to working through these final chapters of the book with you. I think that brings us to the end. And as the 9th, not the 11th General Assembly would say, this podcast is over. We are very grateful for the time that you have spent with us. If you have questions or comments, anything you'd like to follow up on, you can reach out to us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. We'd be happy to engage with you in that way. There are links below where you can support the show and keep the lights on for us from week to week. There are notes that we've attached to this with a couple of links to some further reading you might want to do. We are very grateful for the time that y'all spend with us. We are glad to have a reason to produce this content. We appreciate you listeners very much. Scott is reconnecting, so I don't know if he'll say it, but gentlemen, it's time for us to say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Y'all take care.